Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this first ERSA Regio Academic Lecture 2018. I'm very pleased to be here and I'd like to thank the European Regional Studies Association and DG Regio for the kind invitation. This afternoon we'll talk about EU cohesion policy, what works and where. First of all, let me mention that the research that we present is the result of the combination of academic work that I have been conducting with a number of colleagues at the LSE and in a number of other institutions. So I'd like to thank them all for their help, their support, and really this lecture is the result of a long-term teamwork. Of course, I remain responsible for all the results and all the mistakes. I'd like also to mention that this lecture is a step in a longer pathway of conversations and discussions and academic research concerning the EU cohesion policy and its impact. We started in 2016 organizing a special session at the European Regional Studies Association conference in Vienna together with Ugo Fratesi and Vastilis Monasteriotis. And then with Ugo Fratesi and Vastilis Monasteriotis we kept organizing a number of sessions in events organized by the Regional Studies Association and the European Regional Science Association. The next event is going to take place at the ERSA Congress in Cork in August 2018. So if you have papers, if you are interested in the topic, please do submit your work. More than 40 different academic papers being presented and discussed in these sessions. Also a special issue is forthcoming in regional studies, editors again, myself, with Ugo Fratesi and Vastilis Monasteriotis, 10 papers now at an advanced stage, and the topic is back to regional policies. So the idea is to what extent the EU cohesion policy is delivering result at the EU level for the entire European Union. So a long-term path, as I mentioned before. Today's talk, I will start by discussing how we are now approaching the conversation on the future of the EU cohesion policy after 2020. And I will frame the debate more generally in what has happened in the EU region in the past 10 years. And I will present something that I would call a double challenge for EU cohesion policy. A challenge in terms of how globalization is impacting the regions of the European Union on the one hand, but also a challenge concerning the current political climate and the process of change in the EU. I will discuss why we need a strong EU cohesion policy after 2020, and I will compare the more political rationale with the idea that the EU cohesion policy needs to be justified in light of an EU value added and in particular in terms of its impact. And I will go on discussing how we can single out, how we can identify the impact of EU cohesion policy. And I will argue that we know very well how regions work, but we know much less how policies work in practice. And this will be the very core of this ERSA lecture. How policies work in practice. What works, where, under what conditions. So I will discuss how academic research can contribute to the answer of these fundamental questions for the future of the EU cohesion policy. I will discuss different approaches and how different approaches to the analysis of the EU cohesion policy can be combined in order to provide support for evidence-based policy making. So let me start by discussing the crisis that we have been challenging, that we have been facing in the past decade. The 2008, the Great Recession, implied a severe contraction in economic activity and employment in virtually all regions of Europe. As a result of this challenge, the EU cohesion policy itself needed to shift and change in order to be able to offer a response to the crisis that the EU regions were facing. New and emerging local needs were confronted. As a result, the EU cohesion policies needed to be readjusted, reorganized in many cases, with giving to the regions and the member states more flexibility. At the same time, cuts in government expenditure in many, of national expenditure in many areas of public policy making required, in some cases, a sort of compensatory mechanism to make sure that some key services were still delivered in many European Latin regions. So the Great Recession implied contraction of economic activity in the regions and change in the EU cohesion policy as a response. At the same time, the recovery patterns of the EU regions have been highly asymmetric. Some regions recovered much faster than others. Some regions, in particular the less developed regions of Europe, are in many cases struggling to find their pathway towards recovery. And of course, this generates new demands for EU cohesion policy. How can EU cohesion policy work in order to facilitate recovery where regions are struggling to find their way after the crisis? So the first challenge comes from the Great Recession in 2008. A highly diversified set of impacts. If we look at this map, we can see the average annual growth rate of regional GDP per capita in the period between 2008 and 2010. This comes from a paper by myself, with Davide Luca and Simona Emilio, where we explore the link between national macroeconomic dynamics and regional performance during the crisis. And this map gives us an idea of the strength of the crisis, how strong was the decline in GDP per capita across the regions of Europe. And we can see patterns of strong diversification, very diversified regional impacts of the crisis. If the crisis affected GDP, it has also determined substantial changes in foreign direct investment, in the availability of private capital, in this case foreign private capital, to the regions of Europe. In this map, you can see the difference, the changes, is joint work with Simona Iammarino on regional studies. And what we do, we look at changes in foreign direct investments towards the regions of the European Union before and after the crisis. So we compare inward foreign direct investment, the flows of inward foreign direct investment before the crisis and after the crisis, and we can see with different colors the regions that suffered a decline, the regions in red, and the regions that suffered, that benefited from an increase in foreign direct investment after the crisis. And we can see again a very diversified pattern that shows how some regions have really struggled, are really struggling to re-enter the process of global capital circulation following the crisis. So again, a very complex geography of the crisis that is a major challenge for the EU cohesion policy. The EU cohesion policy after 2020 needs to deal with a highly complex situation of regional disparities. So if the 2008, if the Great Recession was a challenge, then we have a second set of problems that are related with starting in 2016 with Brexit, with the decision of the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. This is, on the one hand, a political crisis. It's something that puts in question the very foundations of the identity of the European Union, but as also a crisis that has significant financial and economic implications. The UK played a relevant role in shaping EU policies, including the progressive shift of resources from the common agricultural policy towards cohesion policy. Now, the UK will not be part of the European Union once the new decisions on the budget will be taken. So cohesion policy, in a certain sense, has a different type of support in terms of the member states that will participate in the decisions over the post-2020 budget. As a result, of course, of the departure of the United Kingdom, also a net contributor to the EU budget is not there anymore, and this creates pressures on the EU budget in terms of how to compensate for the reduction in available funding for the budget. So which policies will need to be rediscussed, reconsidered in light of the more stringent budget constraint. If we look very briefly at the net contribution to the EU budget of the different member states before and after Brexit, we can see how the net position of a number of countries has changed, and how, in the case of Germany, France, in part the Netherlands, much less so in Italy, the net contribution of these member states will increase following Brexit. Therefore, this calls for a reconsideration of policies in order to make sure that the benefits and the contributions to the EU budget remain balanced for all member states. Of course, so if Brexit has generated, has political implications for the way in which EU member states can think about their policies, and has changed the situation of the EU budget, Brexit itself has substantially asymmetric spatial impacts on the regions of Europe, with new demands for cohesion policy in order to deal with new asymmetric shocks that will take place via trade and foreign direct investments. This map that comes from the work by Chen, Loss, McCann, Ortega-Argiles, Thyssen, and Van Hart, 2018, where these colleagues looked at the regional impacts of Brexit on the regions of the EU, we can see that some regions will suffer more in terms of local labor income exposed to Brexit than other regions in Europe. As a consequence, Brexit will also generate additional asymmetric shocks, additional asymmetric impacts on all regions of Europe, determining an additional challenge that cohesion policy will have to deal with. So we can think about two crises and a stream of issues that started in 2008 that are putting EU cohesion policy under pressure to do more, to deal with more asymmetric conditions, more regional asymmetries, with very complex subnational and sub-regional geographies. So if the challenges that EU cohesion policy has to deal with have increased, like we mentioned before, there is an increased pressure on available resources for less developed regions. There is uncertainty over the overall resources available in the post-2020 EU budget. And if we think about the communication of the Commission regarding the priorities of the post-2020 EU budget released on February 14, 2018, we can already see some critical elements for the less developed regions of Europe. Already in March 2017, President Juncker was discussing the idea that sometimes less is more. The EU27 could focus on areas where we make a real difference. And it was suggesting that EU states could regain control over matters ranging from regional development to consumer protection. And these ideas that entered the debate in March 2017 are again present in the initial ideas that the Commission has tabled for the conversation, for the debate over the post-2020 European budget. So if we think about the double challenge, more shocks, more regional disparities, more diversified challenges for the EU cohesion policy on the one hand, potentially more reduced availability of financial resources, we can think about an existential challenge for the EU cohesion policy. And of course, the reduction in available resources might mean a potential discontinuity in public policies for less developed regions throughout Europe. In many regions, cohesion policy is the only development tool available. And we have seen in the natural experiment offered by the United Kingdom that when less developed regions are left alone to bargain for their own resources in the national context, it is very difficult for them to regain the same attention and the same resources that they have been able to obtain in the EU context, when acting together with other less developed regions in order to put forward their developmental needs. So the EU cohesion policy is facing a major challenge, and in order to assert or reassert its role as a key EU policy, EU cohesion policy cannot rely on purely political arguments. such as the EU cohesion policy is needed for redistributive purposes. Less developed regions are voting against European integration, therefore we need to buy them into the process of European integration by means of EU cohesion policy. These arguments, while important, are not enough for the EU cohesion policy to remain a central policy in the EU panorama. If we look very briefly at regional GDP and trust in the EU, here we have from Eurobarometer, we have the tendency of people, of local residents, to trust the European Union, and here we have the GDP per head in the different regions, making the EU average 100. We can see that at very different levels of GDP, the trust on the EU is also highly diversified. It's very hard to identify any clear relationship between less developed regions having an income per capita below the EU average and having less trust into the EU. For the same band of income in between 50% and 100% of the EU average, we have a huge range of values of trust in the EU. And here you can see in red the regions of the United Kingdom. Again, you can see that for the same level of income, we have very diversified, for similar levels of regional income, we have very different levels of trust in the European Union. Therefore, it's hard to make an argument that has some support in the data that less developed regions are voting less for the EU or are less committed to the process of European integration. And the same is true if we look in particular in the votes in the EU referendum in the United Kingdom. Here you can see the share of leave votes in different regions and their GDP per capita. There seem to be, if we look at the very raw data, there seems to be a negative relationship. So it seems that regions that have lower GDP per capita voted more leave. But if we get rid of just one single outlier, that is London, the correlation almost completely disappears. So it's very hard to make a well-grounded argument on the political behavior of Latin regions. And it's very hard to think about this relationship in any meaningful statistical sense. If we take, for example, one region in this distribution, Cambridgeshire, and we zoom into the region, this is a map of the region based on an elaboration joint with Marco Di Cataldo and Marajua, based on BBC data, and we can see that inside the Cambridgeshire region, we have the area of Cambridge, where the leave votes are very low, and then we have the surrounding area where people disproportionately voted to leave the EU. So even within the same region, the voting patterns, voting behaviors are highly diversified. So it's very hard to find support for an argument, a political argument, saying a political rationale for the EU cohesion policy, saying we need cohesion policy in order to buy in lagging regions into the process of European integration. Therefore, the EU cohesion policy needs to look for an economic justification, needs a strong economic rationale, and it can have an economic justification if it is able to prove that it is an EU economic priority. In terms of equity, thinking about the asymmetric impacts of the process of European integration, the asymmetric impact of some of the EU policies, but also the asymmetric impact of some crises that affect the European Union, including Brexit. An equity argument that needs to be reconciled with an efficiency argument, and the equity and efficiency arguments can be reconciled if the EU cohesion policy moves away from the idea of supporting lagging regions as such, but becomes a tool to remove developmental bottlenecks in all regions and a way to respond to global challenges. So the idea is we aim to target developmental bottlenecks to allow EU regional economies to develop, grow, and deal with asymmetric impacts of global challenges. So an economic priority for the EU as a whole, but also the EU cohesion policy needs to show that it works, needs to show that it can deliver impact. Not only economic impacts matter, of course, but all impacts should be testable against a credible benchmark. So the EU cohesion policy needs to be able to show that it works, that it delivers, that it is value for money, that it is the best use of public resources versus other alternative options. So it needs to show that it is not only able to deliver impact, but it is effective, that it's making the best use of the public resources that are devoted to the policy. So what I would like to argue is that in the existing scholarly and policy debates on the EU cohesion policy, we have focused a lot on how regions work, on the functioning of regions. It is a very dynamic field of research in economic geography, regional economics, urban planning, and so on and so forth. And remarkable attention, the EU cohesion policy has shown a remarkable capability to take on board state-of-the-art academic work. And the Barker report is a very successful example in this regard. Or the concept of smart specialization, a very new concept in academia, has been immediately translated as a matter of months into a flagship policy for the entire European Union. So this shows that there is a remarkable capability of the policy to take on board new concepts on how regions work. And also in terms of our understanding, our empirical understanding of the functioning of the regional economies in Europe, the quality of data has been constantly improving. And this has allowed us strong conceptualizations, strong theories of regional development, improving data quality. This has allowed us to develop very accurate diagnosis of the problems, of the developmental bottlenecks, of the challenges of the EU regions. And I think the cohesion reports are a great example of this. They are extremely informative and extremely provide very significant insights into the state of the art of the economies of the EU regions. And I don't think in any other part of the world, including the United States, such accurate and systematic diagnosis and analysis of the state of sub-regional economies are available. Therefore, we have been extremely good in developing a diagnostic approach and in developing diagnosis of the conditions of the regions of Europe. However, much less attention has been devoted to the idea of how regional policies work in practice. How do they work and where in terms of economic outcomes? So the development of diagnostic tools has not grown hand in hand with the development of a body of research on how policies work. It's a more recent stream of research that has been rapidly developing. However, it's still difficult to draw general conclusions on the existing analysis of the EU regional policy, of regional policies. Still, this stream of research suffers from significant data barriers. However, some virtuous example, for example, Open Cohesione in Italy, that has been systematically collecting very detailed expenditure data, is a clear example that it is possible to go in this direction, that it is possible to make the data availability on the policies improve its quality in parallel with the improvement data quality on the regions, on how the regions, on regional economies. However, still we have a substantial gap. Sophisticated diagnoses are not matched by well-tested medications. So we know how regions work, we are very good in our diagnosis, but we are much less effective in having well-tested medications, in finding and having available tools that can address the problems that we have identified in the diagnostic part of our analysis. Regions have been told, and very rightly so, to invest more in innovation, increase and improve their human capital, reinforce their institutions. This is what comes from the analysis of the regional economies. However, if all regions were good at this kind of thing, well, these problems wouldn't exist today. So telling regions you should improve your human capital, you should improve your institutions is clearly not enough. Generic recipes, generic recommendations are good cover-ups for rent-seeking by local elites. If we give very generic indications, then all sorts of policies can be designed as a response, and it is very difficult to show that they work. It is very difficult for regions that have weak institutional environments to design effective tools to respond to their own problems. So the fundamental question becomes how to achieve these goals in practice, given local conditions. What works in practice? How to achieve these goals? Where? What are the conditions under which different tools can be used successfully to address the problems identified in the diagnostic part? So our movement from diagnosis into medications, into practically solving problems, has been significantly weaker. What we need is a theory-driven empirical work, quantitative work, qualitative work, mixed methods, experimental methods. So we need a diversified set of methods that needs to leverage real policy data and information, that needs to meet certain quality requirements in terms of falsifiability and reproducibility, in order to be able to give concrete answers, in order to be able to make available to the regions tools that work, that can allow them to concretely, practically address their developmental bottlenecks, those that we have identified in the diagnostic part of our analysis. In order to do this, we need to leverage complementarities between different streams of research in order to test different tools and understand how they work under what conditions. If we look at the existing literature, we do have very interesting examples, and we can think about three different streams of research. We have a stream of research that has focused on the question, does it work? Does the policy work? And these streams of research has looked at the net impact of the policies by means of counterfactual methods. This is what we can call the identification approach. So the fundamental research question in this stream of research is, does it work? On the one hand. On the other hand, we have a stream of research that has targeted the contextualization of the policy, has looked at the interaction between the policies, between in particular the EU cohesion policy, and the context and the characteristics of the regions in which the policy was active. This stream of research has addressed the question of where, under what conditions, the policy can deliver results. This analysis has focused on the territorial contextual conditions and on the factors that condition success and failure. And at the intersection, I think, between these two streams of research, we have the fundamental question of what works. And in these streams of research, we have some analysis of the heterogeneous effects of policies and programs in different contexts, where the idea of identifying the impacts by means of appropriate counterfactual methods is reconciled with understanding under what conditions impacts can emerge. So we move away from a dichotomic answer, does it work or not, 0-1, into a much more nuanced answers that try to answer the question, okay, what works under different conditions? What are the characteristics of the different policies, of the different programs that can deliver results, taking into account the appropriate counterfactual, what would have happened without the policy. So in this stream of research, at the intersection between the two, we can keep a strong attention to the problem of the development of an appropriate counterfactual for policy evaluation, while trying to capture the heterogeneous characteristics of the policy itself, of the programs that make it possible to maximize impacts. So these three streams of research, and in particular the interaction between the two, have tried to address the fundamental question of understanding the very nature of the policy and its capability to address the fundamental challenges that regions face. Let me start by discussing some examples of research that has addressed the question, does it work? So some example from my own research where we try to contribute to this stream of research focus on the identification of the net impact. So what is the impact of the policy over and above the existing conditions of the regions, of the beneficiary regions. So there is an emerging literature on the counterfactual assessment, in particular, of cohesion policy impacts. And in these streams of research, we have somewhat a separation between EU-wide studies, so studies that try to look at the entire European Union regions. We have work by Becker, Pellegrini, Percoco, and others, versus one-country studies. So research that went at a much finer geographical scale in order to identify the impacts of the EU cohesion policy, but focused on individual countries. We have the work by Marco Di Cataldo, focusing on the United Kingdom, and Marajua looking at the case of Italy. However, in this stream of research, there are still some key questions that remain unanswered. First of all, does cohesion policy boost regional growth and employment? In particular, in the post-crisis period, understanding how and to what extent EU cohesion policy can help regional employment is a fundamental question. On top of gains in terms of productivity, in terms of economic growth, to what extent EU cohesion policy allows to reconcile productivity and regional employment. And the other fundamental question is, do regions in all member states benefit from cohesion policy? Are there significant differences across member states in terms of the capability of their regions to benefit from the EU cohesion policy? In a recent paper with Marajua, we employ a spatial regression discontinuity design to estimate distinct but fully comparable regional impacts for each individual member state in terms of economic growth and economic employment before the crisis and during recovery. We compare eligible and non-eligible areas by means of a spatial forcing variable that allows us to identify the net impact of the policy, but in a way that is country-specific, but at the same time comparable. This is just to give you an idea. The full working paper is available online, of the geography of the treated and the non-treated regions, and how we compare treated regions, regions receiving EU structural funds with regions that don't, and how we try to identify the impacts of EU cohesion policy across EU regions. In this table, you can see the initial results from our paper. And we can see that the EU cohesion policy has an impact that is valid throughout Europe in terms of economic growth and in terms of employment. So in line with the existing EU-wide literature, we are able to identify a positive and significant impact of the EU cohesion policy in terms of both regional economic growth and regional employment. So this is a first key result and the first contribution to the definition of the EU value added and impact that justifies EU cohesion policy. EU cohesion policy is able to deliver, both in terms of regional growth and employment. However, our research also sheds light on how different countries, how different member states and the regions in those member states have been able to benefit in different ways from the EU cohesion policy. So we can compare the regional impacts of the EU cohesion policy for Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK in terms of economic growth and in terms of employment. And a first key insight from this table is that we can see that German regions have been the one that attracted most of the benefits from the EU cohesion policy in terms of productivity, in terms of economic growth. We can see that the overall EU-wide result is largely concentrated in German regions. Conversely, if we look at employment, UK regions have been the one benefiting the most. So while regional impacts in terms of employment are more diversified, as you can see, also Italian regions benefited, but large part of the impact, in particular the impact that survives after the crisis, is concentrated in UK regions. So we said, like I mentioned before, we have a positive EU-wide impact on both regional growth and employment. The positive impact on regional employment has survived the crisis, so it remains valid when we split our analysis into periods before and after the crisis. And the EU cohesion policy has been able to support less developed regions in the recovery period. However, as we could see from the table that I mentioned before, the positive effects are unevenly distributed across member states. The regional growth bonus is largely concentrated in Germany. Impacts on regional employment are largely confined to the UK regions. Italian beneficiary regions experience better employment performance, like we saw in the table before, but this effect ended with the crisis. So while the EU cohesion policy has been able to support employment, then when the crisis arrived, the resilience capabilities of beneficiary regions were not developed enough for this employment to resist the crisis. Spanish beneficiary regions have benefited in terms of better growth during recovery. So the EU cohesion policy beneficiary regions have been able to recover faster in terms of productivity, with no impacts, however, on employment. So in the post-Brexit Europe, EU cohesion policy remains an EU-wide public good. This is our overall result on growth and employment. However, a better adaptation of the policy to the needs and overarching public policy objectives of each individual member state might be the best complement to the current place-based approach. It's not only about regions, but we do need to take into account the priorities, we need to take into account the specificities of the individual countries. So macroeconomic national framework conditions do matter in terms of the impacts of the EU cohesion policy. Therefore, it's not only about the bottom-up, but a EU cohesion policy that is able to deliver needs to take into account the national level much more. So if this is an example of the insights that we can get when using counterfactual method in order to assess the net impact of the policy, still very interesting insights come from the analysis of the contextual conditions, the factors that the ecosystem in which the policy acts, interacts, and functions in practice. Again, we have a lively stream of research that tries to answer the question, fundamental question, under what conditions? In another paper, in this stream of research with Marajua, published in 2016 in Environmental Planning A, we compare the territorial implications of a fully top-down policy, as the common agricultural policy, with the increasingly bottom-up approach of the EU cohesion policy. So the idea here is that we want to compare different models of intervention. We say the common agricultural policy is a policy that is designed at EU level and works in the same way for all EU regions. We focus in this part of the analysis largely on the first pillar of the common agricultural policy, the market intervention part. So it's clearly a policy that is space neutral in its intent, but clearly not in its impact, as I will show you in a moment. And we compare, so the top-down model of intervention of the common agricultural policy with the more and increasingly more bottom-up approach of the EU cohesion policy, and we try to compare the territorial implications of these two models of intervention. Like I mentioned before, we are interested in the link between different models of intervention, purely top-down, increasingly bottom-up, we want to link these models of interventions with the heterogeneous territorial conditions that characterize the different beneficiary regions. And we test the association. Here we can only discuss about associations because we cannot develop a fully reliable counterfactual, but we can still test some very insightful and very robust associations between regional growth and regional level expenditure for the EU cohesion policy, rural development policy, and the common agricultural policy over 2 decades, from 1994 until 2013. When we compare these different models of intervention and we interact these different models of interventions with heterogeneous regional conditions, we find that the positive impact, the positive influence, of the EU cohesion policy on regional growth is stronger in regions with the most favorable socio-economic initial conditions. So we do find a positive correlation between expenditure on EU cohesion policy and regional growth. However, this correlation is stronger in regions that have better initial conditions, where the initial socio-economic environment is already more developed and more supportive of the process of economic growth. Conversely, the top-down resources that come from the common agricultural policies, have a positive link with regional economic performance in the most deprived regions of the EU. If you focus only on the most deprived regions, the automatic mechanisms associated with the common agricultural policy seem more equipped to give resources to the less developed regions, seem better placed to provide regions, to provide the less developed regions, the most deprived regions of the Union, with funds that are needed for the process of economic development, the process of regional growth to get started. So this tells us something about the potential challenges of a bottom-up approach. The fact that regions that have weaker institutional conditions, that have a stronger concentration of socio-economic deprivation, might struggle to benefit from a policy that has very complex design, very complex application procedures, resulting in lower absorption rates in the less deprived regions and their lower capabilities to implement sophisticated regional development policies. The automatic mechanisms of a purely top-down policy have been able to give resources to the regions that suffer from the most the stronger disadvantage in terms of socio-economic conditions. So this tells us a lot on the one hand how the different approaches, the top-down and the bottom-up, need to be coordinated if we want the most deprived regions to benefit from EU cohesion policy. But also tells us something about the importance of the coordination between different policies. The correlation between expenditure and regional growth is maximized where all EU policies are coordinated, where their action is coordinated and integrated in the best possible way. So this tells us that EU policies cannot be considered in isolation, but their impacts and their interaction at the regional level needs to be considered and designed in a coordinated and systematic fashion. In another paper, again looking at the conditions that allow the policy to deliver. Before we discussed the link between contextual conditions and different models of intervention. In another paper, a joint work with Ugo Fratesi and Vassilis Monastiriotis, we try and bridge a case study approach with econometric analysis. Like I mentioned before, in order to answer the fundamental questions about the policy, we need to combine different methods. And we implement a quantitative assessment of 15 selected regions, employing both quantitative and qualitative information, very detailed information on expenditure and local achievements. This makes it possible to explore the link between the structure of expenditure, so how are resources being spent on the ground, the alignment between expenditure and local needs, and a variety of objective and subjective local achievements going beyond purely economic impact. The results suggest that the structure of expenditure is a key conditioning factor for impact. So saying, does the policy work or not, is not enough. We really need to think about, okay, how has been the policy implemented in practice? What is the structure of expenditure? Is it highly concentrated or widespread, given to a large number of beneficiaries, or highly concentrated towards a few beneficiaries? And another important precondition for the policy to be correlated with regional economic performance is consistency. Consistency in terms of planning interventions and the alignment between the objectives of the policy and on-the-ground needs. The consistency and alignment are key conditioning factors for all types of achievements, not only for economic achievements. So again, we do have, from this stream of research, significant insights on how the policy can be designed in order to work best under different territorial conditions. So we discussed approaches that focus their attention on the identification of the net impact of the policy. We have a stream of research that try to place the policy in the context and look at the structure of the policy and look at the territorial conditions in which the policy acts. And at the intersection between these two streams of research, we have a third stream of research that answers the fundamental question, what works? What are the characteristics of different programs and different policies, policy options, policy tools that can maximize impacts, that allow us, given the different conditions, to maximize the net impact of the policy. In this stream of research, I'd like to mention and to give you some insights on a recent work that I've been conducting with Guido de Blasio at the Bank of Italy and Maraggiù at the University of Roma III, where we try and think about the impacts of smart specialization programs. It is too early to address the question of what works in smart specialization programs. It's too early for any rigorous evaluation of the current 2014-2020 smart specialization programs. However, for the post-2020 EU cohesion policy, we will have to make important policy decisions. What needs to be discontinued, what needs to be changed in the existing smart specialization policies. Therefore, what we did is try to see if there is anything that we can learn from the past that is applicable to today's smart specialization programs. So we can still look at the past and analyze what we call smart specialization forerunner programs. So to look at programs that have been implemented in the previous programming period, the 2007-2013 period, therefore that we can evaluate by means of appropriate counterfactual methods, that have a number of features that recall smart specialization programs, so that we can analyze the returns to the different characteristics, to the different features of the program, in order to be able to see what can be improved in existing smart specialization programs, but also what can be changed, what can be improved when thinking about the next generation of smart specialization programs. So in this joint work with Guido de Blasio and Maraggiù, we evaluate the impact of a particular scheme that is called Collaborative Industrial Research, CIR, that was implemented in the less developed regions in Italy to support the innovative activities of firms located, like I said, in less developed regions. And this particular program was funded with 1 billion euros. And the EU cohesion policy co-financed this program in 2007-2013. And the interesting thing is that this program anticipates some of the key features of smart specialization strategies program. So it's a policy, it's a sort of historical natural experiment that was designed and implemented in the previous programming period. Therefore, it's possible to evaluate it, to learn something about current programs, and to plan for the future, having at hand rigorous evidence to inform policy decisions. The analysis of this smart specialization forerunner program makes it possible to draw insights on the potential impacts of smart specialization, allows us to address the question what features of smart specialization program work best in the most disadvantaged regions of Europe. So it's not a question, a general question, what is the theory of how regions work in principle, but is how policies, how smart specialization work in practice in the less developed regions of Europe. And what is the impact and the value added of some of the new features that have been introduced into regional innovation policies through the smart specialization strategy. So what is the impact, what is the value added of the characteristics that have been added to regional policies with the smart specialization approach? Is there a value added? And how can we maximize this value added? So these are the fundamental questions that we can address by looking at this particular program by means of appropriate counterfactual methods. Like I said, when we try and follow this approach, we face major data challenges. In order to analyze in depth this program, we need to develop a unique data collection of very detailed program level and firm level data. We needed information on applicants, we needed information on the selection scores, and we need detailed information on the beneficiaries of the program with actual payments and firm characteristics and performance. In order to achieve this objective, we need to combine 5 different data sets with separate information on all these stages. But once this information is available, once this huge challenge in terms of data collection is addressed, then it is possible to use a regression discontinuity design approach that exploits the evaluation score of the application as the forcing variable, based on the idea that some projects were eligible but were not funded due to limited resources. So these projects had all the same characteristics of funded projects. However, unfortunately, they were not funded not because of their lack of quality, but because of the lack of available resources. So the fact that one of those programs is receiving the funds from the policy or not is not a function of the intrinsic quality of the programs, of the application. It's not a result of the intrinsic quality of the participating firms, but is a consequence of a purely exogenous factor, that is the total amount of resources made available by the government and by the EU cohesion policy to fund the program. So this design makes it possible for us to develop an appropriate control group to assess the additional impact of the funding. However, we are not interested, as I mentioned before, in a 0-1 answer. Does the program work or not? But we are interested in the project level heterogeneity. We are interested in exploring what features of the program, what are the features of the program that lead to an impact on the beneficiary firms. And we are interested in the features of the program that closely recall the characteristics of smart specialization, that anticipate the characteristics of many smart specialization programs, so that we can learn what type of characteristics have the highest return, or are likely to have the highest returns in the less developed regions, in this case, in the Italian Mezzogiorno. So this is a table of the heterogeneous impacts of the policy, where we compare different dimensions of the policy, and we look at their impacts on investments by the beneficiary firms, value added, and employment. And we focus on 6 different characteristics of the policy: on the presence of a university in the project partnership, so the extent to which giving incentives to private firms to collaborate with public research institutions is able to deliver a bonus or not. The collaboration, so the size of the partnership, to what extent it makes sense to ask firms to form large groups in order to develop their innovation projects. To what extent the projects that firms have submitted have to do with advanced activities. So these are the activities, the type of activities that they are pursuing. The sector in which the firms are active, more high-tech or low-tech sectors. The extent to which firms have a strong technological capabilities, they are patenting the stock of their patents, and the degree of internationalization, to what extent large multinational corporations are involved into the program. So we can study this result, we can study the heterogeneity of the impacts, and we can draw some initial conclusions. When we analyze the interaction between the impacts and the collaboration with public research centers, we find that participation and involvement of large research centers and universities does not provide any additional impact, does not provide any bonus in terms of additional impact of, from the policy, from the funds on the beneficiary firms. This suggests that probably firms should be able to decide if they want to collaborate or with the university, with the research center or not. Forcing this collaboration or giving incentives for this collaboration to happen when it would have not happened naturally is possibly not the best possible idea. It's not necessarily something that gives returns in terms of policy impacts. Large partnerships have a negative impact on value added and employment. So asking firms to form large partnerships, giving an incentive to firms to develop their projects, their innovation projects in large partnerships, increases transaction costs, makes it difficult for firms to work on the project, and therefore this has negative impacts. However, if we think about the type of activities, pushing firms and towards the most innovative type of activities, so irrespective of the sector of the firms, projects that are implemented in ICT, for example, or in health and biotechnologies, do not show any additional benefit when compared with more traditional activities, for example, activities in the agro-industrial system, in the cultural heritage. This suggests that it's very important to tailor the area of activities of the innovation project to the characteristics of the regions, of the areas in which the firms operate. So in this case, for Italian firms in the Italian Mezzogiorno, the more traditional activities, so innovation, the project is still about industrial innovation, but innovation in more traditional areas of activities, such as the agro-industrial system of the cultural heritage, might deliver the best results. However, the most important evidence that we find by exploring the heterogeneity of the impacts of this smart specialization-like program is the idea that firms operating in low-tech economic sectors benefit the most from the program. So impacts are stronger for firms that operate in low-tech sectors. It's not necessarily high-tech. Probably firms that operate in high-tech sectors, in more technologically advanced sectors, need to rely less on this type of funding, while firms in less advanced regions might be more in need of public support for their research and development industrial research programs, and therefore they benefit the most. But it is also needs to be understood in the context of the less developed regions of the EU, in this case the Italian Mezzogiorno, where firms operating in low-tech sectors might find more local complementarities, therefore being able to maximize the spillovers originated from their own industrial research. Firms with consolidated innovative activities, these two results are aligned. Firms with more consolidated innovative capabilities, those that already have a substantial patent stock, reduce their investment. So the policy has a crowding out effect. Public resources are replacing private investments by the beneficiary firms, and they tend to focus only on value added. Therefore, we need to be very careful in terms of making sure that the policy delivers a value added and does not simply crowd out private investments. And also, the analysis of the feature of the program also highlights a challenge in terms of the returns from the policy for large internationalized firms. It's not surprising that it is hard to take on board, to convince multinational firms, large internationalized firms, to participate in collaborative industrial research programs. This research shows that there is a challenge, there is a problem here, because those firms struggle to benefit from this program. Transaction costs for them are very high, they have access to their internal funding network that can support their industrial research programs. Therefore, when they participate, it's harder to identify a net impact from the funds. So, let me draw some general conclusions. We have, at the beginning, we have looked at a double challenge that EU regions are facing. They are facing multiple shocks in terms of asymmetric recovery from the Great Recession and the asymmetric impacts of Brexit. They are facing changing budget constraints for development policies. So these two, they need to do more. They need to take care of more needs with changing financial conditions, constitute a double pressure for the EU regions on the one hand and the EU cohesion policy on the other. However, the EU cohesion policy, in light of the challenges that I mentioned before, the EU cohesion policy can and should remain central after 2020. However, to remain central in a changing Europe, the EU cohesion policy needs to be able to show an evidence-based, clear economic evidence on its EU-level value added and on its impact, on its capability to deliver visible, measurable results. We need to move from, and we need to improve our ability to deliver these analyses. We have a very good understanding on how regions work. We have developed very good diagnostic tools. We have very good data to shed light on the functioning of the EU regions. However, more work is definitely needed on how regional policies work in practice. What we need are well-tested medications. We don't need more grand theories of regional development, but we need very clear insights on what works on the ground, under what conditions, and where. These are the key questions that academic research and policymakers need to address for the EU cohesion policy to remain central in the post-2020 Europe. This is an exciting field of research that combines identification and contextualization. So this stream of research is moving away from a dichotomic answer 0-1. It works, it doesn't work. To think more carefully about the use of counterfactual methods, of methods that make it possible to identify the net impact of the policy, to reconcile counterfactual method with the understanding of the heterogeneity of both the contextual conditions in which the policy operates and the heterogeneity of the policy itself, of the very different ways, of the many different ways in which the policy can be designed and implemented on the ground. So we need to develop an approach towards gradual, transparent, evidence-based policy learning. Evidence-based policy learning is based on a number of conditions. So we need to develop ex ante, in itinere, ex post evaluation of policy, programs, and projects beyond formal requirements. So a culture of evaluation at all stages of the policy process needs to be incorporated in daily policy making. This needs to become a key flagship feature of the post-2020 EU cohesion policy. Data. Data are fundamentally important, are crucially important. We need open data. We need to improve the availability of data at the firm, individual beneficiary level in all member states. We do have, like I mentioned before, very interesting examples of best practices in some member states. Availability of open data at the beneficiary level needs to become the norm in all member states to be able to design EU-wide analysis on the functioning and the impacts of the EU cohesion policy. We need to be eclectic in the use of methods. This is about the use of qualitative methods, like some of the examples that I mentioned, with quantitative methods, mixed method research. And machine learning might be a very interesting tool to be applied to this set of problems. However, we need to set very stringent requirements in terms of what are the valid methods that can be used in order to consider evidence acceptable, for new evidence to enter policy thinking, to enter the conversation on what works and what doesn't. We really need to set very stringent requirements for the methodologies that are used. We need valid methods, we need methods that provide external validity of the results, and we need a careful reflection on the extent to which the results can be transferred. Like in this example that I mentioned before, on the Smart Specialization Forerunner program. This particular evaluation exercise was implemented for a sample of firms in the Italian Mezzogiorno, looking at the program implemented in Italy. To what extent this evidence can be transferred to other member states. That's why we need more comparable data that make it possible to run analysis with a similar approach, evaluating other programs with similar features in other EU member states. So we need to think about the external validity of our results as well as the transferability of the results. We need an eclectic evidence-based selection of policy tools. So based on this evidence, we need to develop a set of tools that we know work, that work in different conditions, and therefore we need, when dealing with the problems of individual regions, we need to match our diagnosis of the local conditions with the tools that we have available that we know that work in the different conditions. And we need to select the tools on the basis of clear evidence. But we need to select the tools in an eclectic fashion to make sure that the tools that we select are aligned with the needs of the regions where the tools are being used. Top-down and bottom-up approaches need to be carefully integrated. Thinking about regional policies exclusively or largely as a bottom-up process does not work. We really need to reconsider this and think about how the top-down and the bottom-up level can and should be coordinated and reconciled. And also the coordination across policies. When thinking about the post-2020 debate on the EU policies, EU cohesion policy needs to be placed in the wider framework of all European policies. And we need to think about how different policies interact. And we need to think about how they can be coordinated in the post-2020 Europe. The way to go is based on small-scale experimentation. It's not, the way to go is not based on flagship concepts, quickly translated and scaled up on an EU scale. But the best way to proceed, the best way to develop an evidence-based policy learning, to incorporate an evidence-based policy learning into EU cohesion policy is to start with small-scale experimentation with continuous feedback mechanisms. So we start small, we start experimenting, we have a continuous system of evaluation with feedback going from the local level and circulating up to the EU level. And then if it works on a small scale, then we scale up the program, but we scale up in a dynamic way. We scale up by thinking what should be improved based on the feedback that we have received on what we have implemented. So the way to go is to base small-scale experimentation on an evidence-based policy learning mechanism. If this can be achieved, then the EU cohesion policy is likely to maximize its impacts. And based on impacts, on measurable impacts, EU cohesion policy remains a central policy for the regions of Europe and for the EU as a whole. Thank you very much for your attention. Let me briefly mention that we have launched at the LSE, with the LSE team, with the support of the European Research Council, a new blog that discusses the link between global investments and local economic development. Some of the issues that I mentioned are being discussed in the blog with very accessible blog posts. So I do invite you to visit our blog to have more information and stay tuned with the conversation. Thank you very much for joining.